if you look at Canada as a whole, like there's really only a couple of areas where most of the population is. So there's Toronto, there's Vancouver, there's parts of Alberta, and then there's Quebec, mostly Montreal. And that's pretty much where most of the population is, right? Canada, now we're hitting closer to that 40 million mark of population. So in order to explore the Canadian real estate market, you have to get some context on how we kind of got here and what actually it is that affects the dynamics, right? Like the populations, the cities, the primary markets, and why things are so crazy. Because across the world nowadays, it's known that Canada has this like crazy housing market and we might possibly be in this massive bubble. And no one really understands why. Obviously, there's a lot of other countries in the Western world that are pretty established and their markets are a little bit more stabilized than ours. But I think Canada has it pretty bad. It's like one of the most, I would say, challenging markets, to say the least. And it's important to understand this stuff if you're moving here or if you're someone that's looking to buy or sell a property. Like, I didn't understand a lot of this stuff prior to getting into real estate myself, but that's pretty normal, I think. But nowadays, people are getting more and more educated, and you need to be, especially if you're going to get involved in the near future with any aspect of real estate in Canada, because it's important to know this stuff, especially with where the market's headed, and you want to kind of have an idea of where that will be. So if you look at Canada as a whole, like there's really only a couple of areas where most of the population is. So there's Toronto, there's Vancouver, there's parts of Alberta, and then there's Quebec, mostly Montreal. And that's pretty much where most of the population is, right? Canada, now we're hitting closer to that 40 million mark of population. But I mean, just in the greater Toronto area and surrounding alone, I believe the population's like between 3 to 5 million. And then in the greater Vancouver area, it's a little bit less. And then, there's the rest of it is like very scattered. Like it's in different areas across Canada. There's other major cities, but I would say like a good chunk of the population is in very specific parts of British Columbia and Ontario. And within these provinces, I would say it's just a couple hundred kilometers where most of the population exists. And that might be fine, right? Like if the population's contained, but the issue is like as the population grows, those areas where everything is focused, that's where most of the infrastructure is, right? So if you look at all the building and development that happens, any major corporations that come in and start up businesses, they want to be around there because that's where everyone's going to buy, that's where everyone's going to live. So in order for those businesses to work, in order for builders to build houses and have people to sell them to or have people to rent them out to, they're going to need a population. So the issue is because it's such a small area and that's where everybody is, you have to either go up or you have to expand outwards. And for the longest time, that's why if you look at Toronto, it's known across the world as being one of the cities with the largest number of cranes in the sky. So what that means is there's so much building happening going upwards. There's tall buildings always going up because everyone wants to go up. They don't want to expand out. No one wants to leave the area because that's where everything is. And that's somewhat manageable, again, with a certain population, right? You could build up, you could expand a little bit outwards. Like we'll see areas around Toronto or around Vancouver that get built out a little bit, but they're still within an hour of Toronto. And that's where everyone wants to be because some people might be okay with being away from the city, but they still want to be within driving distance to be able to go there for weekends, whatever it is. Now, the issue is this was all fine and manageable, but now we have massive immigration. So the issue with that is you have so many people coming in that same system of just building up, trying to like divide houses into multiple different sections or, having small rental units and doing like infill development, it's not really cutting it anymore, right? So there's too many people. And on top of that, outside of the real estate aspect of it, there's just not enough infrastructure, right? Like jobs, hospitals, like all these things, they're starting to hit a point where there's not enough people or enough servicing for the amount of people that there are, especially people coming in. Like we're seeing 500,000 to 1 million people coming in every year, and Canada's population is hitting 40 million right now. So if you look at it, if it continues, like we're going to add 25% more to the population, of which most people want to be in these same areas I discussed. Because the thing is, most of the people that are coming in from different countries, they want to be around their communities. And guess where those communities are? Just like any other major city or major hub across the world, it's going to be in the major cities, right? Like Toronto, like Vancouver. So people that are coming in want to be there as well. So it's just putting a lot of pressure on very small areas, which in turn is causing the prices to just rise because there's not enough supply, right? There's not enough supply of anything for that matter. But where you live and the place you want to stay at, whether you're renting or buying, that's going to be the first and foremost thing, right? It's a necessity, it's shelter. And then anything else after that is also being affected because there's just not enough of it for the amount of people that are coming in or already here. If you look at like what impacts real estate specifically, like you go deeper into it, even within like real estate in terms of like the amount of housing that we can make available for the amount of people coming in, I would say across Canada, it's actually better in these bigger areas because you actually have enough people working that can build houses. There's enough people qualified, like builders, trades that can build. But throughout Canada, if you look, the numbers are really low. There's actually a big problem here. There's a shortage of people that are qualified to build houses or work on different aspects of a house, like electricians, plumbers, etc. So we don't even have enough trades to meet the demand for the build. So even if, let's say, we have a plan to build outwards, right? Like people start going further away from these cities and they try to make it so that it's enough room for people to kind of like move outwards. There's actually places to live at. There's not going to be enough people to actually build those things because there's not enough trades that are qualified. Now, on top of that, within real estate, another thing that is very challenging in Canada is financing. So financing here compared to the US, there's not enough lenders. Like almost every industry here is monopolized, as much as people don't understand that. Like if you work in the telecommunications industry, for example, there's only 3 major companies. If you look at the banks here, there's only 5 major banks. If you look at pretty much anything across the board, like when it comes to financing, there's very key players, and then outside of that, there's not a lot of options. And the issue with that is when people are trying to buy houses or when people are trying to build or they're starting businesses, there's challenges because a lot of the Western world, and Canada especially, is built on debt. So you have to take out a loan to start anything. You have to mortgage a house. Most people are mortgaging when they're getting a house. Most people are taking on loans when they're getting businesses or if they already have a business, right? If they're struggling, especially when times are tough like now. So if your options are limited for financing, it's really hard to get in. And with housing specifically, the other issue is there's only specific types of products. So you can only get a mortgage fixed for 5 years. That's why, like, compared to the US right now, we're actually in a more dangerous place because most Canadians' mortgages renew every 5 years. Whereas in the US, it's 30 years. So you can lock in your mortgage. If you get 2% rate, it's locked in for 30 years. And that's what a lot of people did when rates were super low. But now we're entering a point where even us and the US, we're seeing rates that we haven't seen in like 20 years. So a lot of people that have low rates, they have a renewal coming next year, the year after that, or maybe even in like 3 to 6 months. So that's really going to impact how people are able to manage their finances, the type of property they could buy, if they could even afford to continue owning a home, right? So there's a lot of pressure on the economy. And that leads on to the next thing, right, which is the household debt levels in Canada. They're amongst one of the highest in the G7 countries. So if you look at Canada's debt levels, especially compared to 10, 20 years ago, maybe rates were pretty high back then too. Now our debt levels are way higher, right? And things are way more expensive. So that really impacts what people can do because the income levels haven't changed, but debts are a lot higher. So a bigger portion of the same income is going every month to paying off a larger credit card debt, a larger car loan payment, a larger mortgage payment. So it just really doesn't help. And then a lot of times the assets or the products that people are using to buy or using the debt to buy, they're more expensive. So the debt is higher, right? It just makes sense. It's inflation. So that adds another factor in, because if you have such high debt levels and you have so much pressure on the economy where prices are rising, but people's incomes are the same, it's not really going to help, right? It's only going to get worse until like everything becomes unaffordable, and a bigger and bigger portion of people's payments are going towards debt, especially now with rates rising. You have higher debt levels, you have much higher interest rates, you have people's renewals coming, and people's incomes are the same. Now, the reason why this stuff is important to know is because you probably haven't thought about it, because the economy hasn't been affected too badly, right? Like our delinquency rates in Canada are pretty low compared to a lot of other countries in the world. They're below 1%. So, people don't often default on their mortgages. We never had like a 2008 US crash type of situation, but that could very well change because of everything I described, right? Like it's like a snowball effect, and it doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. Now, the supply and demand issues especially, and the amount of immigration we have coming in, it's probably going to cause the system to break unless there's a lot of easing to those constraints, right? Like the debt levels, the amount of building that can happen in terms of housing, just affordability, incomes. Like something needs to change, or else if you keep everything the same, then eventually it'll just kind of explode. In terms of what we're looking at going forward, if you think about it, because something does need to change, we're either going to have to see a lot of people like deleverage. So people will have to sell assets. They'll have to keep more cash on hand, pay off debts. So maybe people will have to sell their houses, pay off their mortgage, and then take that money to pay off more debts, because a lot of people have high credit card debts. That's one of the main things. It's consumer debt, not like asset-backed debt, right? A lot of people have that. So maybe they'll be paying that stuff off so they can stay afloat until things get better. If they get better, we're going to have to see immigration policies maybe change, where if everything else can't change, at least the problem can be contained a little better if you see the pressure that's coming inwards get reduced a little bit. The other thing is if there's like some massive stimulation to the economy that comes through like housing grants on a massive level. Like they've done small stuff like remove HST from new builds and development, like stuff like that helps, but it's not nearly enough to actually make a difference. So in essence, you need like some massive shifts in all these areas where all the problems exist to actually create a solution. But obviously it's probably not going to happen simultaneously, but it needs to actually be contained. And something needs to start, right? Like, so I would say like, first off, you need to have like less debt levels growing. You need to contain the demand that's being put on all these things like the services and the housing, which is either going to come through obviously like either people leaving or less people coming in, right? So immigration. And you need the housing side of things to really see a change. So we need like an overhaul in terms of like building policies. You need a lot more stuff happening in terms of builds quicker, so there's more supply and there's less people fighting over the same houses. So unless all that stuff happens, you're not going to really see a change, and you're probably going to see like a catastrophic decline, which obviously we shouldn't see that happen. But then again, nowadays with everything we see that's happened with the economy, even the past 18 months from like the peak of the market in 2022 till now, I don't know, right? It's like unpredictable. So no one really knows, but there needs to be a change. These are just some kind of like opinions I'm seeing like as an agent on the ground level as well, just seeing the trends in the market and just my conversations with people that are either looking to buy, sell, or invest. And yeah, if you're someone that's looking to get into the market, especially in the Hamilton or surrounding area, like, feel free to reach out to me. I'll leave my contact info below, so you can reach out to me there. And yeah.